Okay, is everybody seated? Okay, so we can continue. Okay, welcome again this time for the students. Welcome to this year's Yom HaShoah Remembrance and keynote address. For the students who don't know me, my name is Werner Steger. I teach here. I'm the chair of the History Department of History, Government, and Economics. Today is a day of remembrance. We have gathered here to remember. We remember the singularity of the Holocaust in history, of what Auschwitz survivor Jean Amery called, quote, the total inner logic and appalling rationality. We remember the victims, those who perished in the cataclysm of violence unleashed by the Nazis against Europe's Jews. We honor the survivors who bore witness and whose stories embody important lessons for future generations. But April is also the month of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. On April 19, 1943, on the eve of Passover, the day chosen by the Nazis for the final liquidation of the ghetto, the remaining Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto staged an uprising against impossible odds. The full name of today's day, Yom HaShoah, is Yom HaShoah HaGevura, Holocaust and Heroism Day. So we remember heroism and resistance. And last not least, we commemorate the Shoah today in order to commit ourselves and future generations to never again. But more recent history has shown that our work remains woefully incomplete. For April 2014 is also the 20th anniversary of a memorable speech given by then Vice President Al Gore in front of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Vice President Gore was eloquent, describing the Holocaust not as an event, quote, to be remembered just by those who survived. He says there's no better place for the memorial than Washington, he goes on. No better place than to remind those leaders who make the agonizing decisions of foreign policy of the consequences of those decisions, end of quote. The very next day, the genocide of the Tutsi started in Rwanda. And despite being fully informed on the genocidal character of the massacres, the United States, along with the rest of the world, looked on as between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed within a span of 90 days. I leave you with the words of the German philosopher Karl Jaspers. This is what he had to say on the question of German guilt. That was also the title of his book in 1947, The Question of German Guilt. This is what he has to say. He says, each one of us is guilty insofar as he remained inactive. Impotence excuses. No moral law demands a spectacular death, but passivity knows itself morally guilty of every failure, every neglect to act whenever possible, to shield the imperiled, to relieve wrong, to countervail. Blindness for the misfortune of others, lack of imagination of the heart, inner indifference toward witnessed evil, that is moral guilt. Survivors need not be reminded of this, as they experienced firsthand the indifference of neighbors and former friends. For everybody else, Jaspers' words are a reminder that words without connecting the words never forget to a more responsive future, we have not fully honored the memory of the slain. Now, it is my honor to introduce to you tonight's speaker. Rabbi Paul Golomb is the rabbi of Congregation Achim Yisrael, the Vassar Temple in Poughkeepsie, and I want to say Poughkeepsie, New York, but I think you all know where Poughkeepsie is, so it's just automatic. He is a native of Long Island and a graduate of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. He has been a director of Hillel Foundations in Columbus, Ohio, and Buffalo, New York, and he has been the URJ Regional Director for Canada and has served synagogues in Chicago and Connecticut. Since ordination, Rabbi Golomb has had the opportunity to be involved in a large variety of rabbinic activities, serving large, medium, and small congregations, acting as a chaplain to university students, teaching undergraduate and graduate courses, and working on behalf of the Reform movement. He has published articles on biblical studies, modern Jewish thought, interfaith relations, and Reform Zionism, and is currently the editor-in-chief of the CCAR journal, A Reform Jewish Quarterly. Rabbi Golomb lives in Poughkeepsie with his wife Deborah, we have the honor to welcome here too today, who is a lawyer and a mediator, and they have 2 children and 2 grandchildren. So I'd like to call Rabbi Golomb to the podium, and he will talk to us on the liturgy of Yom HaShoah.
Thank you very much, Werner, and thank you all for being present as witnesses to this evening's liturgy. To some extent, I could just simply stop now and say any questions, because we all had the opportunity to experience a liturgy. The experience that I had reminded me of almost over 35 years ago. I was the director of the Hillel Foundation Jewish students at Ohio State, and we had the honor of having Rabbi Irving or Yitzhak Greenberg to be our scholar in residence for a program that coincided with Yom HaShoah. And a Yom HaShoah liturgy and service commemoration was put together by the students. And then Rabbi Greenberg was going to speak. He scrapped his speech once he heard that particular service and gave a beautiful and meaningful, and at least for me, very memorable meditation on the service itself, and on the notion of connecting liturgy to the commemoration of Yom HaShoah. To some extent, my remarks are really not that different from those that Rabbi Greenberg gave back in 1977. But I'd like to begin with a very, very familiar quote from the book of Ecclesiastes. "A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born, a time for dying, a time for planting, a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying, a time for healing, a time for tearing down, a time for building up, a time for throwing stones, a time for gathering them, a time for embracing, a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking, a time for losing, a time for keeping, a time for discarding, a time for ripping, a time for sowing, a time for silence, and a time for speaking." The book of Ecclesiastes is a nuanced, clever, almost subversive book in Tanakh. Indeed, it is part of a section of the Hebrew Scripture that at the very beginning of the Christian era did not exist or be understood as being canonical as part of Scripture itself. And that along with other books such as the Song of Songs and the Book of Esther, indeed what are normally referred to as the Chamesh Megillot, the 5 scrolls, was not necessarily an easy choice to include within the canon. That there had to be those who supported it, and there were those who were not quite sure that it belonged. And indeed, arguments against its belonging could be found in its subtle and cynical tone, that there is nothing new under heaven. But it also contains such extraordinary passages such as this one, because on the one hand, what we see is sort of the obvious. Matter of fact, that is one of the things that Ecclesiastes does. It takes what is normative adages, the things that we're so used to, a stitch of time saves 9, fools rush in where 8 angels dare to tread, terms like this that everybody simply knows, and tends to subvert them. Doesn't completely overtake them, but tends to subvert them. After all, listen to the language. There is a time to rend and a time to sow. There's a time to plant. There's a time to uproot what is planted. What we're dealing with seems to be diachronic. We have this time, and then we have that time. And while you're engaged in this time, you're not doing that. And when you're engaged in this time, you're not doing this. But sometimes it is synchronic. Sometimes one can be doing both at the same time. And indeed, the very last line, it is a time to keep silent and a time to speak, tend to come together. And we had an experience of that already built into this evening's observance, a moment of silence. Indeed, when an effort at putting together a comprehensive service, a liturgy for Yom HaShoah that was done by the work of Elie Wiesel, perhaps among the most famous names of thinkers and writers on the Holocaust, the author, of course, of Night, and of Rabbi Albert Friedlander, Alav Shalom, a very important, significant British rabbi who maintained the Westminster Torah Project, the rescue of the Torah scrolls that were found in Prague that were slated to be burned and destroyed, but were indeed rescued and have been distributed around the world and around the nation. The two of them put together 6 days of destruction and then wrote a liturgy that begins with the words, "We begin with silence. The silence of death, the silence of life, the silence after destruction, the silence before creation. There are times when songs falter, when darkness fills life, when martyrdom becomes a constellation of faith. Against the unrelieved black space about us, there are no words to reach beyond the edge of night, no messengers to tell the full tale. There is only silence. The silence of Job, the silence of the 6 million, the silence of memory." My first experience with Yom HaShoah took place in April of 1971. I was a first-year rabbinic student spending the year in Israel. I was 23 years old. I had never experienced, never even knew of the existence of Yom HaShoah, though I was very active in the Hillel Foundation and Jewish life at the undergraduate institution that I attended. It just did not exist. And there I learned, principally through the dean of the College Institute, the seminary, who told us a day or two before what to expect. That at 4:35 on that day, the 27th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, there would be a loud blast of a horn, much like a fire alarm or a bomb incoming alarm, loud blast of a horn that would be heard throughout the city, indeed throughout the nation, and there would be 2 minutes of absolute silence. And indeed, that is exactly what happened. And I was on the phone earlier today with a colleague who lives in Jerusalem. I was speaking to him at roughly 7 o'clock his time, and he said that was the experience today as well. At about 4:30, 2 minutes in which the entire nation comes to a halt. People stop driving wherever they are. People stop moving. If there are machines going on, they are stopped. And for 2 minutes, there is absolute silence. That was my first experience of Yom HaShoah. That's what Yom HaShoah meant. We began with silence. And we could end with silence. Indeed, the origins of Yom HaShoah, and Dr. Steger gave us a sense of it, is that beginning in 1946, survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, those who had made it to Israel and had begun a kibbutz along the coast called Lochmei HaGitaot, the fighters of the ghettos, began to gather on the 13th day of Nisan, right before Erev Pesach, for the eve of Pesach and the first Seder, for a commemoration. They met. It was a relatively private affair that took place in Israel and created the notion of it being a day of outcry and of resistance, and a day of outcry and of courage, Yom HaShoah Gvurah. And so it was for the next few years until it spread out from that group of survivors and touched the life of the young Jewish state itself. A decision was made that the Knesset agreed to quite readily, that it made no sense to try to do this right as people are preparing for the first night Seder. And so instead of doing it on the 13th day of Nisan, it was pushed 2 weeks later to the 27th, where it is observed to this day, to take place right after Pesach rather than immediately before. And it was to be observed first with a number of speeches lowering the flag to half staff, but that 2 minutes of silence. Fundamentally, the liturgy, the first liturgy of Yom HaShoah was this silence. There is a time for silence and a time to speak. Silence needs to be filled. It needs to be given intention. It has to be understood in some fundamental way. What are we being silent about? It's meaningful for those who understand and who have fully taken in what the silence is about, but there needs to be a time to speak. And our observance this evening bespeaks that. We needed to say something. Well, how do we go about saying something? That is the construction of a Yom HaShoah liturgy. As I noted, in 1971, I knew of no Yom HaShoah liturgy. None of my classmates nor the faculty could point to one, but in the next few years, the first efforts at creating a Yom HaShoah liturgy came into existence. When I got to Ohio State Hillel in 1975, in the spring of '76, we made use of the relatively new publication by David Roskies, an extraordinary writer, thinker, poet, and scholar of Eastern Europe, a work called Night Words, Nachtworten, that was created as virtually a do-it-yourself play that everyone would take apart and participate. And we made use of that in that particular year as our way of observing Yom HaShoah. The next year, as I mentioned, the students created a liturgy. A few years later, I'm in Buffalo, and Buffalo has created now an extraordinary gathering for Yom HaShoah, but it had started only a few years earlier. By the mid-1970s, the need for keeping silent had come to an end. There was a need to say something. There was a need to say something to give meaning and weight to the experience of the Holocaust, to create a liturgy. What liturgy? What is actually supposed to be said? What is supposed to be recited? Well, in brief, we don't know yet. We really don't know. What I want to do for the next few minutes is simply give my sense of where we are in the process, a process that I think is not going to be finished in any fixed sort of a fashion, a way in which there will be a relatively universally recognized form of a liturgy for Yom HaShoah. I don't think I know it won't happen in my lifetime. I don't know if it'll happen in my grandchildren's lifetime. And I'll explain that in a little while. But let me just say something about liturgy itself. What do we mean by liturgy? Not all religious traditions have liturgy. The Jewish tradition very much does. It came into existence sometime in the second Christian century, became formalized. We know about it principally through the writings of the early 3rd century document, the Mishnah. And we know that we have a form of synagogue prayer that was well organized and was thoughtful and contained themes and a development that can be analyzed and discussed and could be worthy of a semester's worth of learning to this day. That's the beginning of liturgy. The Catholic Church, for sure, has a liturgy, but take, for instance, the Society of Friends, the Quakers. One comes together for a service and sits in silence until God moves the heart of an individual who rises and speaks. I know that among many of my Protestant friends, there is a book of common prayer, but the way in which the liturgy is going to be constructed might change from week to week. Because, for instance, the issue is not liturgy, the issue is prayer. What does God lay upon your heart? What is it that you wish to say? How do you wish to communicate your own personal relationship? How do you wish to testify? So the words can change from week to week. They can change from moment to moment. They can change even as an individual is speaking. I meant to say something like this, but something else came out. And that would be appropriately a service, but it isn't a liturgy. Of all people, Jerry Seinfeld gives us an insight on this. Seinfeld is not talking about liturgy, but he is talking about the work of a stand-up comic. And he points out that everyone is capable of being funny. Everyone comes up with a beautiful bon mot, a lovely line, something that raises a laughter among all those people around them. Everyone can do that. The real trick, Seinfeld points out, is to be funny on Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. That's the trick. To be funny at Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. That is what a stand-up comic or a comedy writer for a situation comedy show is attempting to do. It is to be funny at a specific time. And what is liturgy? Liturgy is the effort at creating that which is prayer, but doing it 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, 11 o'clock on a Sunday, 4:30 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, at a specific time, creating the elements that produce liturgy, produce a relationship between the individual and what? The individual and the cosmos. We can use God language for this. As a rabbi, I would use God language, but one need not think in terms of God language. One must just think about the notion of connectedness, of finding the words that connect you with the individual who is to one side or to the other side of you, to the individuals you can think about who are dear to you, to the individuals who are about you, to the individuals who represent your past and your heritage, to the individuals who are your vision, your hope, your fondest dreams for a future. And to do that in words that are set there to be recited at 7:30 on a Friday night. That's liturgy. One can understand that that isn't easy. In an essay regarding specifically Jewish literacy, an author begins by talking about, very similar to Jerry Seinfeld, about the improvisational theater. As for a group to come together and to put together a 5-minute play, given a theme, given characters, go ahead and put together a 5-minute play. And those individuals discovering just how difficult that is. You would think that you could do it in just a few moments, but no, it could not be done at all. It is a struggle. It is difficult. Most liturgy that is constructed to this day is occasionally deep and beautiful and searing and elevating, and much of it is banal. We're still a long way from the construction of what the liturgy will be for Yom HaShoah. That's the first part. The second problem is exactly what should be said. what exactly should be said? This has two elements to it that I'll briefly touch on. The first element I can exhibit to you by asking you to tell me what this is. What is this? Now people are going to, it's a book, right? That's all I'm asking. It's a book, right? Anybody disagree? Right? How do you know it's a book? Yeah, cover, pages, so forth. How did you know that? Cultural background, context. Otherwise, this is just simply a complex four-sided figure of a particular sort of color. If you've never seen a book before, you could never say, aha, that's a book. If you do not come from a culture that is familiar with codices, bound books, only knows about tablets and scrolls, you have no idea what this is. But everyone here automatically knows what it is because you are built into a culture and a society that understands that. Liturgy works among individuals who know what's being said, who know the import and the background and the movement of the words. Therefore, in the context of liturgy, we can create a Jewish liturgy for Yom HaShoah that can be done in a synagogue or in a Jewish community that can employ the Hebrew of the Kaddish and the El Malei Rachamim, can use words in the vernacular in the English that are meaningful to Jews and relate and touch Jews. But the Holocaust is something greater and deeper, and it is one of the reasons why this presentation is being done here at the community college and not in a synagogue. It is important for non-Jews to be able to come into contact with a liturgy, come into contact with a liturgy for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Memorial Service. And the context and the background and the use of words in English that Christians use is very different from Jews. There's a Jewish liturgy, and then there's an interfaith liturgy. Note, I don't say a Christian liturgy, an interfaith liturgy. I do not think it's possible to do a Yom HaShoah observance without Jewish presence. But one still must find the proper words that are meaningful and deep to Christians, that allow Christians also to come to grips with, as Dr. Steger pointed out, our universal responsibility. We weren't there. Our parents might not have been there. Our grandparents might not have been there. But nonetheless, if we are to be witnesses to the justice of God, if we are to be individuals who hope for compassion and humanity and peace and reconciliation in a world, we must take responsibility. But the liturgy that will be meaningful to Christians is not exactly the same as the liturgy that is meaningful to Jews. So what is it exactly that we say? And what is it that we wish to mean? While I have noted, and Dr. Steger noted, that at the beginning it was Yom HaShoah Gvura, notice that we don't use the term Gvura very much anymore. The very unfolding, the meaningfulness of Yom HaShoah has changed. It continues to change. It was witness, direct witness of the survivors. It was the stories that the survivors were able to tell to their children that could perhaps be relayed to their grandchildren. But to a great extent, it is not any of that any longer. I use a particular sort of a liturgy for memorial services that are done periodically through the Jewish calendar that still talk about the wound of our time. But for most people who hear that, it is no longer our time. Even I was born after the Shoah had come to an end, after the Nazis had been defeated. I was born in the year in which Israel itself arose as a state. I don't know what exactly it is that needs to be said. I know that we are still struggling to work it out. I believe that an important element is to be found in the thinking of Emil Fackenheim, late philosopher and Jewish thinker, who, writing in his extraordinary book, God's Presence in History, gave us the 614th commandment. Jewish tradition says that Torah has 613 commandments in it. He added a 614th. It was a clever notion, because while in traditional Jewish thought one could accept that the 613 were given by God to Moses at Sinai, where did the 614th one come from? For those who are believers, it came from God as well. And for those who are not believers, it is nonetheless binding. And that 614th commandment was, we do not give Hitler a posthumous victory. But it goes on beyond that. It says, how do we avoid giving Hitler a posthumous victory? We do not engage in otherworldliness, magical thinking that all we have to do is close our eyes and everything will be wonderful. As parents would say to their children when they would feel the terrors and the concerns of going to bed at night, it'll be there, it'll be all right. We can't say that. We know that we have to work through an unredeemed, violent, difficult world. We cannot engage in otherworldliness, nor can we engage in despair. We can't give up on humanity, and we can't give up on ourselves. And we can't give up if it's not on God and it's on the notion of transcendent justice and hope and vision and dreams. That is the 614th commandment, binding on those who are believers and those who are not believers, binding on those who are Jews and those who are not Jews. We're still in the midst of creating, ultimately, what the liturgy of Yom HaShoah will be. We have done a component of it today, and I would hope that it will be done not only next year, but next generation, and 2 generations, and 3 generations from now. And it will continue to be fixed. At this point, the only thing that I'm positive needs to be included in a Yom HaShoah liturgy is the very act of remembering, of stating the story, of hearing the testimony, even as those testimonies become more and more distant from our particular lives. I conclude with the words of Abraham Shlonsky, a survivor, poet, who in this translation said, "In the presence of eyes which witnessed the slaughter, which saw the oppression the heart could not bear, as witnessed the heart that once taught compassion, until the days came to pass that crushed human feeling, I have taken an oath to remember it all, to remember not to forget. Forget not one thing to the last generation, when degradation shall cease, to the last, to its ending, when the rod of instruction shall have come to conclusion, an oath, not in vain passed over the night of the terror, an oath, no morning shall see me at flesh pots again, an oath, lest from this we learned nothing." This year, next year, and many years to come, I would hope that we continue to gather on this day, the 27th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, for a moment of silence, a moment of testimony, a moment of figuring out what exactly it is that we are to learn, that we all take an oath that less from this we have learned nothing. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are questions or not.